The air in the mahogany-paneled chambers of Judge Thomas was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and old corruption, a stark contrast to the sun-scorched, humid morning heat of Ouagadougou. This was no ordinary room. It was a fortress of privilege, a bubble of air-conditioned defiance against the world outside. Within its walls, 3 men plotted in whispers that were as sharp and venomous as daggers. Today, history would be made, but not the history the people hoped for. It would be a history dictated by old agreements and new greed, a final blow to a nation's sovereignty. The stage was set, the players in position, and the people waited with bated breath, unaware of the trap that had been carefully laid in this very room. The silence was heavy with a tension so palpable it seemed to hum. What happens when a man with nothing but the truth faces a system built on lies and backed by millions of dollars? What happens when a nation's dignity is put on trial? Get ready, because the story you're about to hear is one of the most incredible courtroom showdowns you'll ever witness. We're about to expose the secrets hidden in the shadows of power, and we need you to be a part of it. Like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories of African leaders fighting colonial schemes, and comment below to let us know your thoughts on this incredible moment. Judge Thomas adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, their sheen catching the light as his pale fingers drummed a slow, deliberate rhythm against a stack of files marked confidential. He was a man who saw the world not through eyes of justice, but through the cold, calculating lens of profit. Across the polished desk, the French corporate lawyer, Dubois, slid a thick envelope. His eyes, cold as winter steel, met Thomas's. "The mining contracts must be protected at all costs," he hissed, his French accent a cutting whisper. "Traoré thinks he can just waltz in here and challenge decades of established law." Thomas sneered, his American accent cutting through the air like a blade. A third man, a local politician named Sankara, shifted nervously in his leather chair. "Judge, the people love him. If we push too hard—" Thomas's gavel slammed down on the desk with a crack that made both men jump. "The people don't understand international law, Sankara. They don't understand consequences." His voice dropped to a sinister whisper, a promise that chilled the blood. "But they will." The courtroom beyond these chambers was already filling with reporters, diplomats, and citizens hoping to witness something historic. Thomas heard the murmur of voices and the scraping of chairs, the nervous energy of a crowd sensing a pivotal moment. He stood, straightening his black robes and checking his reflection in the window that overlooked the bustling streets below. Market vendors were setting up their colorful displays. Children were running to school. Life was continuing as normal. But Thomas knew that in a few hours, everything would change. Dubois stood up, his expensive suit wrinkled from the humidity despite the air conditioning. He said, "The fine is calculated to bankrupt any resistance movement." Thomas smiled, a predator's grin that never reached his eyes. $500 million. Even a revolutionary can't survive that. He walked to his desk, picked up the prepared judgment, and felt its weight. Today, he would not just fine a man. He would crush the spirit of a nation that dared to challenge the old order. The courthouse steps were a sea of hope, a human tapestry woven from the brilliant red, green, and yellow of 1,000 Burkina Faso flags. Their colors danced against the morning sun, a defiant, living testament to the nation's spirit. The sound was a low, resonant hum, a collective breath held in anticipation. Market vendors, teachers, and students who had skipped classes stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces alive with an energy that was both nervous and unyielding. They weren't just here to witness history, they were here to participate in it. Ibrahim Traoré arrived not in a convoy of armored vehicles, but in a simple government car, a choice that spoke louder than any speech. He had refused the bulletproof car his security team had suggested, an act of faith in his people that infuriated the foreign diplomats waiting inside. His military fatigues were pressed but modest, a stark contrast to the expensive, rumpled suits of the international lawyers gathering like vultures for their meal. He stepped out, and the crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a single, powerful chant, "Ibrahim! Ibrahim! Ibrahim!" He paused at the foot of the steps, placing his hand over his heart, a gesture not for the cameras, but for the soul of his nation. He looked up at the imposing colonial-era building, a structure of white marble and stern columns that had once been a symbol of foreign rule. He said, "Today we face the ghosts of our past," to his aide, a quiet declaration that carried the weight of generations of struggle. He was not just a man walking into a courtroom. He was the embodiment of a people's long-suppressed defiance walking into the heart of their oppression. Inside the marble hallway, the whispers began. European diplomats huddled in corners, their faces tense with the anticipation of his hoped-for downfall. For them, this was a carefully orchestrated show trial, a final act in a long-running play of financial dominance. They watched Ibrahim like shadows, their gazes a mix of arrogance and anxiousness. But their whispers were not the only sound. Local journalists pushed forward, their cameras flashing like lightning, eager to capture every detail of this historic moment. Ibrahim's security detail moved like a protective wall, but his eyes remained calm and focused, his presence commanding a space that had been built to intimidate. He felt the heavy weight of his ancestors' struggles on his shoulders as he stopped before the thick, wooden doors of the courtroom. The air was charged with the silent demand of a nation waiting for its champion to fight for its very soul. He looked back at his legal team, a quiet Burkina Faso woman named Fatou at the front, and his voice was a low, steady rumble. He told them, "Whatever happens in there," his words ringing with the absolute certainty of a man who held the truth, "we speak only truth." With that, he pushed open the doors and stepped inside, ready to face the trap that awaited him. The courtroom fell silent as Ibrahim entered, his presence commanding despite his youth. Judge Thomas sat high on his bench, looking like a colonial administrator from decades past. His black robes billowed as he shuffled through papers, an ominous rustling sound in the hushed chamber. The gallery was a sea of faces, some hopeful, others fearful, all waiting to witness history unfold. Ibrahim took his seat at the defendant's table, a subtle act of defiance, declining to stand when the bailiff announced his entrance. His lawyer, a brilliant Burkina Faso woman named Fatou, leaned over to brief him, but Ibrahim's attention was fixed on Thomas, reading the man's intentions in his cold, calculating stare. Thomas banged his gavel 3 times, the sharp sound echoing off the high ceiling like gunshots. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of imposed justice. Ibrahim straightened in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table. Around him, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. He had faced coups, assassins, and international pressure before. Today would be no different. As Thomas began reading the charges, Ibrahim closed his eyes briefly, saying a silent prayer for his people. Judge Thomas cleared his throat dramatically, savoring the moment like a predator about to strike its prey. The courtroom held its collective breath as he lifted the prepared judgment, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to unleash. "President Traoré," he began, his voice dripping with false authority, "this court finds you in violation of international mining agreements signed by previous administrations." The gallery stirred uneasily, sensing the trap that had been carefully laid over months of secret negotiations. Thomas paused, letting the tension build like storm clouds gathering over the savannah. his eyes locked with Ibrahim's, expecting to see fear, but finding only a calm determination that unnerved him. The penalties for breach of these legally binding contracts are severe and non-negotiable, Thomas continued, his American accent grating against the ears of the Burkinabe citizens present. Several diplomats in the front rows leaned forward, their notebooks ready to record this moment of anticipated victory. The French corporate lawyer, Dubois, smiled thinly from his seat, already calculating the profits that would flow back to Paris. Thomas lifted the judgment higher, like a weapon about to deliver a fatal blow. This court hereby orders the immediate payment of punitive damages in the amount of, he paused again, milking the drama, 500 million United States dollars. Gasps echoed through the courtroom like thunder rolling across the African plains. Several supporters stood up in shock, their faces reflecting disbelief and outrage. Ibrahim's legal team exchanged quick glances, their prepared arguments suddenly seeming insignificant against this financial nuclear bomb. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, capturing the moment that was supposed to mark the end of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Thomas banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to the chaos he had unleashed. But in the midst of all this turmoil, Ibrahim Traoré sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The weight of $500 million hung in the air like smoke from a burning village. The courtroom was a maelstrom of shock and outrage, yet in the center of the storm, Ibrahim Traoré sat perfectly still. He was a rock in the chaos, his stillness more commanding than any gavel. The judge, Thomas, leaned back, a sneer of victory on his face, believing his authority was absolute. But as he surveyed his courtroom kingdom, he failed to notice the fire beginning to kindle in Ibrahim's eyes. The young president slowly stood up, and something in his posture made the entire room fall silent once again. Ibrahim rose from his chair like a lion awakening from rest. His movement was so deliberate that every eye in the courtroom followed him. The silence was deafening. Even the court's stenographer stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Judge Thomas, expecting panic or a desperate plea, instead found himself staring into the calm, steady gaze of a man who had faced down much worse than corrupt judges. The diplomatic section shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their carefully orchestrated trial might not go as planned. Ibrahim's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the power of rolling thunder across the savannah. "Your Honor, may I address this court?" Thomas hesitated, his script suddenly feeling inadequate in his sweaty palms. Protocol demanded he allowed the defendant to speak, but something in Ibrahim's tone warned him this was not going to be the desperate plea he had anticipated. "You may proceed," he said, reluctantly, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. For the first time, Ibrahim stepped forward, not towards the judge's bench, but to the gallery filled with his people. His boots clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the hushed courtroom. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to follow him, casting his shadow long and strong across the colonial tiles. 500 million, Ibrahim repeated, his voice now reaching every corner of the room. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces of diplomats, journalists, and citizens alike. A murmur rippled through the gallery, supporters beginning to sit up straighter in their seats. Thomas banged his gavel nervously, but Ibrahim continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. For choosing sovereignty over slavery disguised as partnership. The temperature in the room seemed to shift, as if the very air was responding to Ibrahim's presence. Judge Thomas found himself leaning forward despite his attempt to maintain judicial distance, drawn into the gravitational pull of the young president's conviction. The French lawyer, Dubois, frantically scribbled notes, his confident smirk beginning to fade as he sensed the mood changing around him. Ibrahim placed both hands on the defendant's table and looked directly at Thomas, his eyes blazing with quiet fire. "Your Honor, before you destroy a nation with your judgment, perhaps this court should hear about the real criminals in this room." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a pen dropping would have echoed like thunder. Ibrahim reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents that made Dubois visibly pale. "Your Honor, I present to this court evidence of systematic looting that has drained Africa's wealth for decades." His voice carried across the courtroom like a battle cry, each word precisely chosen and devastatingly delivered. This silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a pen dropping would have echoed like thunder. All eyes turned to Judge Thomas, who suddenly looked like a man watching his world collapse in real time. Dubois frantically gestured for Thomas to stop the proceedings, but it was too late. The truth was spilling out like water from a broken dam. Ibrahim pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal that made the judge's face drain of all color. "Your Honor, perhaps the court should know about your own financial interests in the Kouri gold mine," Ibrahim announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Bank records show regular payments of $50,000 monthly to Thomas Holdings LLC," Ibrahim continued, his voice steady and relentless as morning rain. The gallery erupted in angry shouts, supporters now understanding the full scope of the corruption they were witnessing. Thomas's law clerk, a young Burkina Faso woman, stared at her boss with disgust and disbelief written across her face. "Motion to dismiss based on judicial conflict of interest." Ibrahim's lawyer, Fatou, shouted above the noise. The judge, who had seemed so powerful moments before, now looked like a small man caught in a very large lie. Thomas banged his gavel desperately, his authority crumbling like ancient walls under the assault of truth and transparency. "These proceedings are out of order," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the righteous anger of the people. Dubois was already packing his briefcase, preparing to abandon his compromised ally like a sinking ship. The gallery was on its feet now, a sea of angry faces who had found the justice system rotten to the core. Ibrahim remained calm in the center of the storm, his moral authority growing stronger as Thomas's legal authority crumbled. "Your Honor," Ibrahim declared, his words echoing like a final judgment, "the only criminal in this courtroom is sitting behind that bench." The first to stand was an elderly woman in traditional dress, her weathered hands raised high as she shouted and more, "Liar! Thief!" Within seconds, the entire gallery was on its feet. A wave of righteous fury washed over the colonial courtroom like a flood breaking through ancient barriers. The court had transformed from a temple of imposed justice into a forum of popular uprising. Thomas clutched his gavel like a weapon, but it was powerless against the moral authority of an awakened population. Ibrahim finally stood up, and the crowd fell silent, waiting to hear the words of the man who had exposed the rot at the heart of their justice system. Ibrahim walked slowly toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with irony, "I believe it's time for you to step down from that bench." The words hung in the air like a royal decree. Thomas recoiled in his chair as Ibrahim climbed the first step. "You wanted to fine me $500 million, but you cannot put a price on a people's freedom." Thomas made one final desperate attempt, pointing his gavel at Ibrahim. "I am still the judge in this court," he screamed, but his words were met with derisive laughter. "You were never our judge," Ibrahim replied, his voice soft but carrying absolute authority. "You were just their puppet." Thomas dropped his gavel, the sound of it hitting the floor marking the end of his corrupt reign. He fled through a back door, abandoning his fraudulent authority like a thief escaping in the night. The crowd erupted in celebration, their voices rising in traditional songs of victory. The $500 million fine lay forgotten on the floor, as worthless as the corrupt system that had produced it. Ibrahim emerged from the courthouse to find thousands of supporters, their faces alive with the hope of a people who had reclaimed their dignity. The revolution that had begun in a courtroom had spread to the streets, a testament to the fact that truth always defeats money and manipulation. What did you think of this incredible courtroom showdown? Today we saw a young leader turn a trap into a triumph, proving that justice is not something that can be bought or sold. This is more than a story. It's a lesson in sovereignty and a celebration of African dignity. If you were as moved as we were, like this video and share it with everyone you know. Let us know your thoughts on this historic moment in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of African leaders fighting colonial schemes.